So we are reportedly going to be getting a new Avengers movie that is going to be based off of Avengers Forever. The story is incredibly interesting, and we'll go over how they could adapt that story into the MCU in this video. But what's also very interesting is where exactly they would put this new Avengers movie that is going to be based off of the Avengers Forever story. As far as I'm concerned, there are two options to how they could play this new Avengers film, and both could work rather well depending on how they choose to adapt the story from the comics. And in order to understand the options that Marvel Studios has as far as where to put this Avengers film, you do have to know the story of Avengers Forever. And the story fits really, really perfectly into what is happening in the MCU right now and what is about to happen in the MCU, what's upcoming. Now, the original report, I believe, is from the new insider Holyfield News, who says we could get an announcement about this at D23. And I hope so, because again, the story could be phenomenal. Now, the characters don't exactly matter too much, the Avengers characters in this story, because obviously they'll adapt them to the characters that we have in the MCU currently. The actual team is not the really important part of the Avengers Forever story, but what's really important are the main villains and one of the heroes, actually. And they could actually do a pretty good twist in the MCU with the villains, because the villains of this story are the actual timekeepers. Loki season 1 introduced the timekeepers, however, they were revealed to be fake, basically something made up by Kang the Conqueror. However, the made up story is kind of their actual true story in the comics. In the comics, the timekeepers are real. They were created by He Who Remains, and He Who Remains was the very last director of the Time Variance Authority, or TVA, in the Citadel at the end of time, and he created them prior to the death of that universe. The goal was to have them survive until the end of time so that they could teach the next cycle. Now, to make a long story short, ultimately there would be a version of a universe where they would get destroyed, and then He Who Remains would make them again. He made them to protect time, and there were 3 main timekeepers, but a 4th was reportedly created and exiled to Egypt in 2950 BC. And this part right here is important to the plot of Kang and the timekeepers in the MCU. Because if we go back to Loki season 1 in the final episode, the finale, we see Loki and Sylvie go into the Citadel at the end of time. As they walk further on into the halls of the Citadel, they enter a room where there are 4 statues, but one of them is actually destroyed. We can see 3 statues that are perfectly fine, but on the right side, we can see that one is literally destroyed with the remains of it on the ground. And as we look at these other statues, we can tell that these are the timekeepers. And this was something that was very, very interesting, because the timekeepers were essentially disproven. They were robots created by Kang. They were a ruse. But if that were really the case, then why does He Who Remains have a place that has statues of them? If they weren't real, why have statues of them in your own home? Well, I think that they were real, maybe at one point in time, and I do believe that there were 4 and then 1 got exiled, which is why one of the statues is smashed. He Who Remains smashed the statue when he exiled that timekeeper. That's important to know, and more on this in a bit, but back to Avengers Forever. The timekeepers and Immortus are the main villains. Now, Immortus is a Kang variant that we have already been introduced to at the end in the post-credit scene of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. In the comics, Immortus is again a Kang variant that is approached by the timekeepers, and they ask him, instead of conquering timelines, if he could help them save the timelines. He agrees to help and rebrands himself again as Immortus. We've had him as Nathaniel Richards, Rama Tut, the Scarlet Centurion, and we've also seen Victor Timely in the MCU. And let's not forget about Kang the Conqueror, but this version turns into Immortus. So in Avengers Forever, Rick Jones has the Destiny Force, and Immortus sends his Service Tempest to kill Rick Jones. However, Rick Jones is saved by Kang the Conqueror, not Immortus, but a Kang who is destined to evolve into Immortus. But Immortus sent Tempest and an army against them. So the alien Kree Supreme Intelligence, who we have actually kind of seen in the MCU, tells Rick to use the Destiny Force to summon help. And that's what he does. He ends up calling in Avengers from a bunch of different timelines. The members include Captain America, Hank Pym as Yellowjacket, Hawkeye, Giant Man, who is also Hank Pym, and the Wasp, also called as Songbird and Captain Marvel from the future. And again, like I mentioned, the characters don't exactly matter for the story that's going to happen in the MCU. But in Avengers Forever, what ends up happening is that the Avengers fight Immortus across several different eras of time. They fight in the American Old West, they visit an alternate version of the Avengers in the 1950s. It's basically a giant time battle at different points in time, and you can obviously see how that would fit into what is happening in the MCU right now. But the reason that the timekeepers are trying to stop Rick and the Avengers from becoming a future threat, because they have seen that in the various futures, mankind will travel into space and they will establish a warlike human empire in space, and basically they'll have a galactic Avengers army in space ruled by humans with access to the Destiny Force, and they will basically be a dictatorship to a bunch of alien cultures and races, and they actually get rid of some of the alien races in the process. So the timekeepers are trying to stop the Avengers from becoming this threat. However, the Avengers, Kang the Conqueror, and eventually Immortus all kind of fight for the Avengers to prove that they are actually better than that and that they will not become that. So it's during the battles that they are having through multiple different realities and times that they realize that Immortus possesses the Forever Crystal, which is an artifact that can control multiple realities at once. But ultimately they go up against the Timekeepers and Kang aids the Avengers in battle. The Timekeepers state that they only wish to eliminate those that pose a threat to the future, but they also refuse to eliminate themselves, knowing that versions of themselves would go and turn into time twisters. So since they essentially refuse to get rid of themselves, but still wish to get rid of the Avengers have a huge battle against them. However, the Timekeepers unleash Avengers from corrupted timelines, so evil Avengers from a bunch of different universes. They bring them into the current fight. Ultimately, Immortus decides to help Kang and the Avengers and betrays the Timekeepers, in which the Timekeepers kill Immortus. The Timekeepers ultimately try to make the other Kang turn into Immortus, but something happens where they actually create a Kang and Immortus from a separate being, meaning that Immortus and Kang exist at the same time as two separate individuals, where one is supposed to go on to become the other. They're not supposed to be separate, but in this situation, they become separate. But essentially, the Timekeepers are defeated, and that is essentially the story of Avengers Forever. Now, you could see how that would be pretty epic in the MCU, especially the part where Avengers from corrupted timelines, bad Avengers, come in and fight our good Avengers. That would be awesome to see. Now, going back to the options of where to put an Avengers Forever movie in the MCU, like I mentioned, we have two. The first one would simply be to make this movie Avengers 5. If Marvel Studios really does want to kind of place Kang on the back burner for a little bit because of the whole Jonathan Majors situation, then it might actually be a really cool thing to say the Timekeepers were actually real. Because originally we were led to believe that the Timekeepers ruled the TVA. We learned that that wasn't true. The Timekeeper story wasn't true, and it really was He Who Remains behind everything. And we were led to believe that the Timekeepers were fake and were actually robots. However, perhaps that was just a scheme to let everybody really think that the Timekeepers were in charge, when in reality, the Timekeepers weren't in charge, but maybe Kang did create them. Maybe He Who Remains did create the Timekeepers. They're not robots, but they're out doing other things under the direction of He Who Remains. So if this is true and He Who Remains is gone, now the Timekeepers are out there somewhere. So perhaps they could be the villains of Avengers 5. There's lots of ways you could take this story, and if they are going to actually have Kang in Avengers 5, then that makes it even more interesting, because Kang could use the Timekeepers to enact more of his plan. Or perhaps if the Timekeepers are actually in charge and they're trying to get other Kang variants to do what they want them to do, then we could have other Kang variants to fight and the Timekeepers themselves to fight in Avengers 5. But the other option is this would kind of come either as a part 2 to Avengers Secret Wars, or maybe even a movie entirely on its own after Avengers Secret Wars. We've talked about how Secret Wars might be a part 1 and part 2, or perhaps there could be a secret Avengers movie that comes after Secret Wars that kind of wraps up everything. That's what this could be, because this story really does seem like it could be the ending of Avengers Secret Secret Wars. We've heard that Kang might not be the ultimate villain in Avengers Secret Wars, and while that isn't confirmed yet, if it does however end up being the case, then the timekeepers could be those villains. But this does kind of stray a little bit from the whole Beyonder Secret Wars storyline, which is why it might be a good idea to do this in Avengers 5. But you could do it again at the end of Secret Wars or in a movie after it, where they reveal that the timekeepers are the ones in charge of really everything, and they're going around trying to kill Avengers and could be destroying timelines everywhere that have the Avengers in them. And this is kind of what the Kangs are doing right now. In the post-credit scene for Quantumania, we clearly saw that the Council of Kangs have now realized that the Avengers are a big threat. And one thing that I would love to see them do is get an army of not only Kang variants, but of evil variants of the Avengers and have them go up against our good heroes. Even if it's not a huge army, at some point in time, I do want to see some evil variants of the characters that we know and love, because I think it would be cool. So there are a lot of aspects of the Avengers Forever story that I would really love to see happen in the MCU. And based off of what we've seen from Loki, those statues, I do believe the timekeepers probably do exist out there somewhere. But go ahead and let me know your thoughts about this in the comments down below. Do you want this story to be a part of the MCU or not? Let me know, and please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to keep up to date with the latest MCU news and theories. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. Woof woof.